Tobacco, tobacco, sing sweetly for tobacco. Tobacco is like love, oh, love it, for you see, I will prove it.
All right, folks, I am so excited about our conference we're working on for this class. A conference is an annual event where you share your research and hear the research of others. It can depend on a different discipline, but often these are works in progress where the purpose is you're working toward publishing this research. But other conferences may have different purposes. I go to a couple of different ones in my area of Victorian studies. It's a traditional conference where we're sharing our research in a very collegial environment. It's a wonderful place. It's called the North American Victorian Studies Association. And that's who runs COVE that you've been using for this class. In my work with training teachers, I go to a pod network, which is very similar, but in that conference, we also have lots of workshops. We're trying to offer each other different ways to help people teach better. And they can run the gamut where you'll have a traditional panel where you'll give 20-minute talks, you'll be with maybe two other people. You could have poster presentations where you're showing your research and sitting there and hoping someone comes and talks about your exciting research. It can be very, very different ways. They do depend on your own discipline. So what I have to talk about today is conferencing in general, some tips, because you'll be recording your 8-page paper. I'd also like to give you an example. I like to model a conference presentation. I'll do that a little bit later in this talk. So first, you might be thinking, I've never done this. What are we doing? Why is it an 8-page paper? So it's 8 pages because that tends to turn out to be 20 minutes of a recorded presentation or of a spoken presentation that you're giving live. And this will depend on different areas and disciplines, how this is done. And if you're thinking about conference in the sense of like a business conference or other sort of talks in the public sphere, this may seem like a very boring way of speaking because you would think, no, I want to have slides and talk off the cuff, or I want to prepare my talk, or do something like a TED talk where there's no slides and no notes. Great. But we're going to practice reading your papers because that's a way that conferences are done. And the argument for that is when people are doing some very strict thinking where if you make a mistake, it unravels the project, they may want to read it. So I agree, it can be kind of boring. When I argue for virtual conferencing like the online one we're doing right now, I think we need to think about how we talk to other communities, other public audiences. But I want you to practice what's often done so you get a feel for it. So here's some tips for it to think about, and this depends on different disciplines. When you write it, you'll send like a normal paper to me too, but I want you to also take your paper and make sure that you have, when a paragraph, if it's cut by the page, put that on the next page. That'll make going through your pages, whether on the screen or printed, easier. Consider, and don't worry, this isn't required, but consider this thing called sprezzatura. That's when I have little asides that I'm reading my paper, and then I go, oh, and this is also like, and I explain it further. What you do is you plan those. You maybe write them in the margins or even type them out within your actual document. And what it does is it gives a rhetorical space of, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. And it also makes it feel more casual. And it kind of breaks that barrier between, oh, this is a stodgy paper I'm hearing just read to me, to having more of a live event aspect of it. Not a requirement, just a tip to think about. And now, if we were in an actual conference experience, which you're all welcome to, send your work into Idea Fest for next year. You'll have your talk, and then you would have questions. So if you're going to ever have experience like that, there's going to be water in that room. Make sure you get it because you'll need time to think about that question. So just go ahead and kind of sit back, but yeah, that's a good question. Don't worry, we all do this and we all know it's a line. Then you take your drink, and then you're composed and ready. For this experience you're recording, we're not doing that full experience of having to ask each other questions. But also think about that part of collegiality, part of being good colleagues is make sure when you're attending and you're not the speaker, but also when you're a speaker, that you have questions for the other panelists. Because it can be good to have your work heard and cared about. I also suggest to make sure it's genuine questions and to make sure you're having a question that engages the work and allows your colleague to shine. There's this problem where someone will go, this is more of a comment than a question. They really want to talk about their own research. Don't be that person. Don't do it. All right, let's get to the conference presentation that I'm going to model for you. So this is from, which is one of my favorite conferences, the Victorians Institute had a conference on consumption. So the idea of how is consuming, eating, anything else, how is consuming playing out in Victorian literature? Or how do we as people later consume Victorian fiction or neo-Victorian fiction? Think like steampunk, stuff like that. And I was on the panel, Victorian Vices, Drinking, Smoking, and Prostitution. And I think I peaked too soon. I don't think I'll ever have a panel title that amazing. And it makes me a little sad. This was a very fun conference because it was about consuming, and you just heard that there was a whole paper on alcohol and Victorian literature. We got a pint glass as part of the swag for it. That rarely happens. That was pretty good. So what I'm going to do right now is, in a moment, I'm going to present this paper to you. And then what I'd like you to do is think about sort of what I'm doing with it, and think about maybe critiques you would have too, because it won't be perfect. I've never delivered a perfect conference paper. No one does. So don't worry about it with your own. And then at the end, I'll kind of chat about it and say some things where I may have done differently from before. The red coal of a cigar, consuming relationships through tobacco. What do you imagine when thinking about the Victorian smoker? Perhaps you envision a man smoking in a luxurious parlor, reclining in an overstuffed armchair, or a group of men in a cigar divan, enjoying coffee and tobacco while Trollope's warden falls asleep over his sherbet. Or maybe you see Sherlock Holmes with a pipe that spans the continuum from, as Susan Ziegler puts it, a modest briar into a voluptuous calabash. How does that compare to the way you imagine a 21st century smoker? I ask this because contemporary cigar and pipe smoking communities present themselves as jovial receivers of Victorian culture. They fill their publications with defenses of homosocial camaraderie in the same nostalgic vein as Leigh Hunt's coffee houses and smoking. Following Chesterton, himself a consumer of Victorian culture, smoking clubs propose that to have a horror of tobacco is not to have an abstract standard of right. Though Chesterton argues against the moralizing of smoking, it has the sense of an ethical decision as opposed to the smell as of something sinful. Like Victorian melancholy, cigar and pipe smokers may see their activity as working against the speed of an industrialized world. Smoking means slowing down and contemplating, and Hunt's shadowing off between thinking and no thinking. In the contemplative mode that Hunt suggests, we can join the young Kipling in meditating over how sweet is the rose's scent, tobacco smells sweeter. Or perhaps lament that the Latakia blend prized by Morris and News from Nowhere is now as non-existent as any utopia. So you'll still see Latakia, there's still Cyprian Latakia, but Syrian Latakia, which is what Morse was talking about, we don't have it anymore. A popular quote attributed to Edward Bulwer Lytton, and if you ever heard of A Dark and Stormy Night, that's the guy, even proposes that a pipe is the fountain of contemplation, the source of pleasure, the companion of the wise, and the man who smokes thinks like a philosopher and acts like a Samaritan. The contemplative and ethical, solitary and relational aspects of Victorian smoking culture and its neo-Victorian consumers are quite on display here. A certain Mr. Charles Smith, winner of Pearson's Weekly 1891 pipe contest, submitted a shape poem that exemplifies this subculture of the smoker. In a shape that looks like perhaps a Hungarian or Umpal pipe, Smith praises smoking as the ideal pastime of Victorian men. For Smith, smoking is the sacrament of homosocial camaraderie, as all strife it heals and friendship seals, though the fragrant smoke is also enjoyed in contemplative solitude. Starting at the stem and moving toward the bowl, the shape of the poem fashions a union between the lyrical voice and the pipe as muse. Each contemplative puff from the mouthpiece of the first line feels the very poem it disrupts. But the strife healed by smoking is linked by rhyme to the absent wife of line 14, who either is the trouble driven away by the smoke or is objectified as a means to drive away trouble. John Clare includes the same resonance in his song on tobacco with no ambiguity, since tobacco is the loyal friend in opposition to the troublesome wife. Either way, the preference for pipe over spouse or pipe as spouse is common in Victorian smoking poetry. Kipling embodies both in his poetry, where he presents the meerschaum pipe as a loyal lover, and like his marital love, stinking and stale, his words, to the butt of a dead cigar. I propose that such poetry is evocative of the hidden danger of both Victorian smoking culture and its contemporary admirers, a danger that prose writers engage with the figure of the sinister smoker. The practice of smoking in the text I will look at today disrupts the contemplative mode celebrated in these poems and reveals a threat to communal structures and relationships. In The Mark of the Beast, Kipling may suggest a comfortable intimacy when he notes that talking spoils good tobacco, but Fleet's sacrilege suggests the destructive possibilities of tobacco. That same malice is carried in Alec d'Urberville's Red Coal of a Cigar and Test of the D'Urbervilles, and the waste of the burned length of Grand Court cigar in Daniel Deronda. Idealized homosocial camaraderie is either directly undercut or becomes a liability to heterosocial relationships of any kind, leaving the reader of Victorian literature with the smell as of something sinful. All of this religious and quasi-sacramental language may seem out of place, but it describes the ritualistic nature of smoking. The media critic and philosopher Willem Flusser presents smoking as a profane ritual that offers us the pleasure of a ritual or artistic life without the same rigor. As a ritual gesture, smoking is part of the understanding of the self. According to Flusser, we stylize ourselves through gestures with respect to the world, work, to others, communication, and to ourselves, ritual. Flusser proposes that pipe smoking does not essentially involve seeking others, like his example of dancing or praying. But in these Victorian texts, the other is deeply involved in the acting out of the characters. I further propose that we reveal ourselves when our ritual life is viewed by the other. There is, to borrow from Mikhail Bakhtin, a surplus to our ritual that can be seen by the other, revealing important ethical and communicative implications. The idea of surplus with Bakhtin comes to this image of when we look at each other, I can see the back of your head, you can see the back of mine. We can see something else about each other that we can't see about ourselves. And so Flusser has it where we are stylizing ourselves, we're discovering ourselves. So we bring in the dialogical aspect of Bakhtin that adds this aspect where in smoking depictions we're looking at today's talk, those smoking depictions have an aspect of stylizing ourselves in relation to the other. Mingling the contemplative with the social aspects of smoking, Kipling includes a quiet moment in The Mark of the Beast that exemplifies the pipe as a tool for homosocial communion. Shortly after the horses react with fright toward Fleet, the narrator and Strickland walked about the garden smoking, but saying nothing, because they were friends, and talking spoils good tobacco. Tobacco is associated with contemplative silence here, enabled by the comfort among friends of not needing to speak. The consumption of tobacco forestalls communication, even though the two have much to speak about. By engaging the smoking as contemplation trope, perhaps Kipling emphasizes the inarticulable mystery of Hanuman's divine power that pervades the story. But this attempted moment at homosocial communion through the relief of shared tobacco is undercut by the growing separation between the two men and their friend, Fleet himself and the horses, and even Fleet and his own soul. To finally reach the moment when they saw the soul of Fleet coming back into his eyes, the narrator and Strickland separate themselves from the rest of English society and Fleet, who finds him to act mad like he once did, since they had fought for Fleet's soul with the silver man in that room and had disgraced themselves as Englishmen forever. Their communal silence of smoking then becomes a silence of secrecy, as they never told Fleet what they had done. But that still reflects the narrow homosocial culture of smoking. It is not an open-armed Whitmanian union of all men, but a small gathering of certain men and only men. To smoke means to demarcate membership, whether it's the smoking concerts of the Victorians or the cigarette smoking pariah of today. The return to heterosocial community is not mediated by further smoking, but by the literary confession that we have before us as readers. In this story, Strickland has become a church-going member of society, but for his wife's sake. And the narrator attempts some Anglican orthodoxy by claiming the quite powerful deity of Hanuman is merely a god of stone and brass. The reader, however, leaves with the smell as of something sinful and the unsettling sense that Fleet's ash can never be removed from the two men. In defacing the statue of Hanuman with a cigar, Fleet then opens the story with this same fractured community that the narrator and Strickland experience in the end. We should keep in mind that the temporality confession assumes a separation from the communal human ether and the divine ether. As a confession, the narrator reflects on the past and decides to put it before the public through a desire for atonement and reconciliation. Through a use of tobacco, Fleet mocks the divine and human ether, represented by the statue and the worshippers, claiming his ash stain is the mark of the beast. In a reversal, Fleet becomes the actual beast with a mysterious mark on his chest. That same reversal makes visible the social reality of the narrator and Strickland, who become beasts through marking the silver man's body through torture. Notice that they try to cover their own shame by covering his body, and then try to ritualistically mimic his own nudity through the confession of this story. So I'm very open to Paul Battle's fascinating argument that Fleet could be making a sacrificial offering to Hanuman. I think that's amazing. But Strickland and the narrator are still separated from their own imagined community. Putting out a cigar or tapping out a pipe is not a rare occurrence among smokers. Rather, it is a staining necessity assumed by the act of smoking. You will have to tap out your ash somewhere. You will have to leave a mark somewhere. Smoking always leaves some kind of temporal remnant. Fleet decides to use the aspect of smoking to treat the thou as an it. But the leaving of a mark on the other, whether animate or inanimate, is embedded in the act of smoking. Where Kipling emphasizes the physical remnant of tobacco, Hardy presents it as a sign of danger and menace around the figure of Alec d'Urberville. The young villain of the novel offers an antitype to the lyrical smoker of the poems we've already looked at together. Rather than seeking a homosocial community, he abandons the Brethren, a Methodist community he's a part of, after his conversion to Methodism, even speaking derisively of their prayers for him. But most importantly, he is the epitome of the smoker as a danger to heterosocial relationships, or perhaps the danger of heterosocial relationships. We first meet d'Urberville as a dark figure in a doorway that materializes into a tall young man smoking. The act of smoking itself seems to suggest his character as much as the well-groomed black mustache with curled points. Yeah, he's that clear as the bad guy. Then, during his predatory gaze on Tess through the skeins of his own smoke, the narrator warns us that the tragic mischief of her drama hides behind the blue narcotic haze. Here, the contemplative nature of smoking is transmuted to a dehumanizing fictio. So let's take a moment for my students watching this. An fictio, and that's a new word for you, I haven't taught you about it. That's this thing that happens in poetry and sometimes in prose of the viewer, often a male gaze, describing the beloved from head to toe. Chaucer does it. Even Gerard Manley Hopkins, a Victorian priest, does it, but he does it as looking at a city, as kind of a court lady. It's a way that you view the court lady and it kind of elevates the court lady, but there's something also kind of dehumanizing of it. It's objectifying because it's a description from head to toe. So in Chaucer's Troilus, there's a major one of those. But back to the paper. So let's go back to that sentence to hear it again with the context you have. Here, the contemplative nature of smoking is transmuted to a dehumanizing affixio. Then, on the very night that Alec and Tess become lost in the chase, she is alerted to his presence by both his loud laugh and the red coal of a cigar. Where the blue smoke predicted Tess's future, the red coal reveals Alec's self to us as readers. Smoking in Hardy's novel seems to operate as a sign of Martin Buber's I-it mode, characterized by analysis or use rather than a fully present giving of self as the I-thou mode. The evil of limiting persons to analysis and use extends to the natural world as D'Urberville becomes associated with the mechanical future in contrast to Tess's idyllic agrarian life in the dairy. Along with the emphasis on the red coal, Hardy describes D'Urberville as mechanically lighting his cigar. Presenting smoking as a mechanical act associates it with the demonic energy of the new thresher, described as the red tyrant and plutonic master. Alec even seems out of place when he later joins Tess in forking a plot for spring planting in a purchased frock. Like the cigar smoke of their early meeting, the two are divided at that time from each other and the community by the smoke of dead weeds. That D'Urberville may be part of the problem of industrialization is fascinating because often cigar and pipe smokers see their activity as working against the speed of an industrialized world. We smoke to slow down and contemplate. It takes longer to smoke a cigar than a cigarette. Hand-rolled cigars and age-cut tobacco contend in our imagination with cigarettes from a factory. And his cigar usage is associated with the red machine at the end. The reversal then comes to the vengeance of the pagan goddess Tess, but she will then be taken into custody in her own ritual space of Stonehenge. George Eliot now speaks even more directly than Hardy to the relationship snuffing liability of smoking in Daniel Deronda. When Grandcourt informs Gwendolen that he will not keep his first promise to her and will be inviting Lush back into their lives, Eliot turns to smoking as a metaphor for the damaged and inequitable heterosocial relationship. Here's the quote. There may come a moment when even an excellent husband who has dropped smoking under more or less a pledge during courtship, for the first time, will introduce his cigar smoke between himself and his wife, with the tacit understanding that she will have to put up with it. Mr. Lush was, so to speak, a very large cigar. Where cigar smoke suggested a tragic future in Tess, it now signifies the very barrier the I-it mode introduces between persons who should only greet one another as thou. Like D'Urberville, the character of Grandcourt is aptly represented by his ritualistic relationship with tobacco. Where D'Urberville can be signified by the red coal of a cigar, Grandcourt can be signified by the burned length of his cigar. The future heir of Diplo often wastes cigars, and he treats human persons in the same I-it mode. His reason even for bringing Lush back to his home is that he is useful, and accordingly must be treated civilly. Whether Gwendolen or Lydia, his own children or Lush, everyone for Grandcourt is merely a cigar to be burned and then tossed into the fire. The smell as of something sinful from such a wasteful and objectifying ritual seemed to be finally diffused then by the ethical stance of the quite contemplative Daniel Deronda. Tobacco is a means of generosity for Deronda, who keeps the cigar case merely to indulge the other. Let's look at that quote directly. He looked around him with a quiet air of respect habitual to him among equals, ordered whiskey and water, and offered the contents of his cigar case, which, characteristically enough, he always carried and hardly ever used for his own behoof, having reasons for not smoking himself, but liking to indulge others. And the group of philosophers seems to offer renewed ritual smoking. Rather than the wasted cigar, everyone has a modest clay pipe, and quotes Shelley. As any ritual, however, smoking at the hand and banner reveals both the self and the community to any participant observer. These men may be contemplative smokers who quote poetry, but they are all men. We are back in the Victorian ideal of smoking as a ritual that demarcates homosocial communion through contemplation. Deronda has reasons for not engaging in smoking himself, but that places him in the same outsider role as a Lydia, who offers a cigar to Grandcourt in one of their final encounters. Now that we've come full circle to the very problematic subculture these texts seem to destabilize, what does that mean for the neo-Victorian smokers of today? Perhaps we can no longer blithely quote Chesterton or chortle at a clever shape poem. But does that mean we should only carry around a cold cigar case like Daniel Deronda? Should we refuse the revealing ritual that, as Flusser proposes, shows us both ourselves and the nature of ritual acts? Perhaps we can still make use of that Chesterton quote, but in light of the wisdom of Victorian novelists. He argues that the Puritan response to smoking lacks an abstract standard of right. And perhaps we could say that the sinister smoker lacks the same standard. Quitting cigars won't make Grandcourt and D'Urberville suddenly good persons. Throwing out Smith's pipe won't make him a good husband. Their ethical failings run deeper than tobacco usage. But having an abstract standard of right, the ideal of encountering the other as thou instead of it, just might be what the subculture needs. If we approach the question of smoking through the I-thou mode, we can acknowledge the communal possibilities of sharing a smoke without losing the sight of the surplus of vision available to the non-smoking observer. Well, I told you that wouldn't be perfect. There were mistakes in there. I've done jump cuts to kind of take those apart, but lift some in because in a live experience, those will be in there. It's kind of part of doing a conference paper. There's not always that much time to practice them. Some people are writing them on the plane. So what I like to do is kind of think about this paper. In some ways, this was a successful one. It was enjoyed by the people who heard it. They were very interested in it. It turned into some historical questions I wasn't always prepared for, like when exactly were cigarettes introduced to English culture. I knew it was the Crimean War, but I couldn't think about the date at the time. But people were engaged by it. Here's the deal, though. I regret this conference paper so much. In some ways, this class, the way I'm teaching it, is trying to make up for that. Here's why I regret it. I go too far in the hermeneutics of suspicion in a way that's sort of like, oh, I'm thinking about these things about these other people, even though it's a community I have association with. And I'm sorry for that. There's this tendency, you want to be the witty conference paper. You want people to enjoy it. You want to make people laugh during it. And I'm not saying don't do hermeneutics of suspicion. We know critical thinking is very important in our society and very important for us as researchers. But I think I just gave you an example of going too far. I'm talking about dialogical relationships in this paper, about the I-thou mode, which is how I greet the other and the dignity of the human person from Martin Buber. We talked about in our previous lectures before. And I don't think this paper follows that for contemporary smokers. I think treats them as an it. And that's the thing about it. You end up playing a role when you do these papers. You're thinking about, you're seeking truth as a researcher. That's always the goal of research, seeking truth, seeking knowledge of reality. But there's also a role you start playing where the paper stuff kind of takes on like, this is how the argument is working. And oh, I can work with Chesterton's idea. And I kind of related to you before my previous lecture. I love Chesterton, one of my favorite poets and essayists. So that's something to think about. And what I want you to think about in context of your own is you will grow after this class as writers. I gave this paper in 2018. Were I to do it again, I would talk about it differently. Some of the lectures you've had are me rethinking this content and how these different things go together. So I want to encourage you to Write your papers in a way, try to enjoy it. Think about what would be something that you could say. Practice it to see how those words feel coming from you in an embodied way, and then change it to what feels best when you're saying it. Enjoy it, but also engage it, do your best, but don't worry. Conference papers are not perfect. They're actually very relational. You tend to know the people in the room, and they may be working on similar things, maybe working on different things. And it depends on the discipline. I don't want to promise this, but often you'll have those pre-existing relationships and there'll be people there to support you. So I want you to imagine that kind of experience. That's how I'll be reading your papers.
Tobacco is like love. Oh, love it. For you see, I have